switch back. And on behalf of the U.S. China Institute at the University of Southern California, I welcome everyone to this webinar, which is also being, in addition to being seen on YouTube or on Zoom, it's also on YouTube. And so we're really happy to have everybody tuning in. And now I'd like to take a moment just to introduce our panelists. We've got a terrific group with us, only one of whom is with us here from Taiwan. We were all in Taiwan together just a day or two ago. Ray, could you simply introduce yourself, say where you're from?
Hi, everyone. I am Ray Wong from Taiwan National Zhengzhi University.
Thank you. And Shelley has been based in Taiwan for the last several months. She's currently reaching us via Hong Kong. Shelley, could you introduce yourself?
Hi, Shelley Rigger. I teach at Davidson College in North Carolina normally, but I'm on a sabbatical this year, funded by the fabulous Fulbright Foundation, which has allowed me to spend 4 months in Taiwan. And now I am en route, pausing briefly in Hong Kong to work out some visa things on my way to Shanghai.
That's great. Thank you, Shelley. And now we turn to Dan Lynch. Dan was a professor here at USC for a couple of decades, but now comes to us from Hong Kong. Dan, say hello and introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Dan Lynch, professor of Asian and International Studies at the City University of Hong Kong in Kuomintang. After spending a week with Clay and Tom last week in Taiwan for the elections, now back in Hong Kong. Great to be here.
That's great. Thank you, Dan. And coming from the second floor of the same building that I'm in is Tom Holohan. Tom, would you introduce yourself, please?
Hi, I'm Tom Holohan. I'm a professor in the Annenberg School for Communication at USC. And I am, as they say, just back from Taiwan. So I am very badly jet lagged.
Yes, I share the pain. We're delighted to have this group with us. I'm going to take just a moment to go through a few statistics so that everybody is on the same page vis-a-vis the election outcome. I do want to point out that all of the attendees, so all of the folks whose pictures we can't see, but who are watching, you can begin to raise questions through the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. So if you want to raise a question for our panel, please feel free to do so. We'll probably go to the questions from attendees, from other people who are participating towards the end of the program. But there you can post your question, others can see the question. If they want to vote it up, they can vote it up. So let's begin if we can. So we're going to share this screen, and so everybody can hear my voiceover as we quickly go through these slides. So Taiwan, of course, has been having elections for some time, and this is the big presidential election combined with a legislative election seat by seat, as well as a party list, party endorsement election. So people were asked to cast 3 different ballots, something that they were educated about through the advertising, through the big rallies. Now, 2 days before the final vote in Taipei, the Kuomintang had its giant rally at the center of the city. And so all of us were in attendance. We saw this. People across Taiwan watched it on television, watched the speeches, and participated vicariously in the event. The very next day, the day before the election, when the Kuomintang moved its roadshow to Kaohsiung, in Taipei, the Democratic Progressive Party held its big rally in the same space that the Kuomintang had been there earlier. And it was, in both cases, a very passionate affair. Also demographically quite distinct, and we'll come back to that question. So at the conclusion of both of the rallies, the presidential candidates joined hands or somehow joined with their vice presidential candidates and saluted the audience. So we had Tsai Ing-wen representing the Democratic Progressive Party, and we had Kuo-yu representing the Kuomintang. And then it was time to vote. And this is on the left of your screen, an example of the ballot. And this was posted at one of the polling places. So you went in and voted 1, 2, or 3. And that also found its way into the elections, how to vote. When you go in, you had to deposit your cell phones. Cell phones were not permitted inside the polling places. You registered and then you cast your ballot. And for those who have been in Taiwan during this process, you've seen this. And this is a remarkable thing because in polling place by polling place, they count the votes. And they count the votes with anyone who chooses watching. And so they go through pulling the ballots out one by one, reading them off, counting them up. Now, at the conclusion of this count, Tsai Ing-wen had a record number of votes for president, 8.2 million, accounting for 57% of the presidential votes. The number 2 contender, Kuo-yu, had much fewer, right? 5.5 million votes. And you can see on the map on your right, the concentration. And so the color schematic, the darker the green or the darker the blue, that means the greater percentage for either the DPP or the KMT candidates. And so you can see that in some cases, the pattern is similar, but what you see is a lot more light blue than you used to. These are the results from previous presidential elections. In 1996, there was essentially just Lee Dong-hui and confirmed as the president. 2000, a split vote that resulted in the DPP coming to power. 2008, you had the Kuomintang return to power. And then 2016, Tsai Ing-wen becomes the first female president of Taiwan. In the legislative yuan, you had a battle there for control. The Democratic Progressive Party, Tsai's party, won 61 seats, which is a decline from the 2016 figure. The Kuomintang picked up a few seats, but is by far a smaller entity. And then you have the rise of these newer parties, the Taiwan People's Party, the New Power Party, the State Building Party, which picked up seats as well. Now, something that Taiwan has that may be unfamiliar for some folks is you also have a party list and you have a party vote. And there you see a much closer race between the DPP and the KMT. And you see significant votes going for the Taiwan People's Party and also for the New Power Party. You see a decline in the People First Party vote totals. But I know that a couple of our speakers may want to return to this. So that's enough for the map, for the statistics. Let's get to the heart of the matter. And let me go down the list and ask each of you, what was your big takeaway for the election? What did this mean in Taiwan? What did this mean for the people of Taiwan? Why did this result? Why did things turn out this way? And what does it mean? And Shelley, why don't you start us off?
Okay. I think my biggest takeaway from the election is probably shaped a lot by the fact that I've spent the last 4 months interviewing young people, ages 18 to 30, about various political topics. But definitely what jumped out to me was an enormous generation gap. Statistically speaking, if you just look at the polls before the election, and we don't have post-election exit polling, but we do have pre-election polling, in the older age groups, especially people above about 40, or really it's more exaggerated in the 50 and up, Tsai Ing-wen and Kuo-yu were about tied, equally popular with older voters. But for voters in the youngest decade, so 20 to 29, the ratio of Tsai Ing-wen supporters to Han Kuo-yu supporters was somewhere, depending on the poll, between 3-1 and 6-1.
Not
So
even
that is
close.
just a huge, huge difference where the younger voters were just overwhelmingly in support of Tsai, whereas older voters were more divided. So that would be my main takeaway.
Thank you. Ray, what do you take away from this election?
My takeaway on this one, well, just echo what Shelley had just said. First of all, the generation gap is widening and become very obvious. And I think this will have great impact, not just inside the Taiwanese politics, but also in cross-strait relations as well, especially when the Beijing see the result. So they not seeing this year result, but also seeing they might be losing the hope for the peaceful unification for the future decade or even 2 decades, because the younger generation and younger you ask, they have very, very solid attitude toward the unification. Basically, basically all my students, for example, they all say, well, they are Taiwanese, not Chinese. So I think this trend become very, very confirmed. And this really make Beijing and other people worry. So, yeah.
Ray, let me interrupt you there. That's a very good point. You've just already jumped to the unification question, what this might mean for cross-straits relations, and we'll come back to that big theme. Dan and Tom, let's start with Dan. What were your takeaways?
Well, my big takeaway was that the Republic of China concept, the Zhonghua Minguo concept, and with its full panoply of meaning, all the history, the culture, and so on, that was in a sense, for the first time ever, really clearly up for referendum, right? Because the Han Kuo-yu people, mostly middle-aged and older, really look back nostalgically on the period 20 years ago and beyond, when the Republic of China concept really mattered and was a critically important was the national identity, or at least the dominant national identity. So now that has been rejected, especially by building on Shelley and Ray's points, the younger generation. So, you know, if you're among the older people in Taiwan who still identify with the Republic of China, of course, but also you're across the strait in the People's Republic of China, you have to really look askance and be worried about the fact that people, basically the vast majority in Taiwan, no longer strongly identify with the ROC concept. Now, of course, the DPP since 1999 has said we accept the name Republic of China as the name of Taiwan, the name of our country right now, but we reject all that China-centered history. We want to move toward a Taiwan-centric Taiwan national identity. And so it's going to be interesting to see how the KMT adapts to that new reality, how the CCP adapts to it as well.
Okay, thank you. Tom, what do you think? What was your big takeaway?
Well, I was in Taiwan as part of a delegation sponsored by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And as a result, we were taken around to meet various officials, government officials and party officials. And so we stopped by several of the major parties and got a chance to interact with campaign strategists and spokespersons. And the most noteworthy thing we discovered on visiting the KMT was that they really had no strategy to try to engage young voters. No strategy. And I mean, when asked the question, well, what would you tell young voters in order to try to secure their votes? The answer was, well, we don't know, but we think that eventually as they age, they'll become KMT voters. So it was a very curious answer and frankly contradictory to everything we at least know about American politics, which suggests that partisanship becomes habit and that the longer people are connected to a political party, the more difficult it is to convince them to change to become something else. So I frankly think that there could be a major realignment as the KMT is challenged to reinvent itself in the midst of a failure that's this dramatic.
Thank you. I want to remind those who are viewing the conversation that you're able to jump into the conversation by raising questions. So click on that Q&A icon and type in your question, and we will get to those a little bit later in our discussion. Now, several of you raised some ideas about why the young voted this way, but I want to drill down a little bit. Is it just the relationship with China that matters to young voters? Shelley, you've been spending a lot of time on this. What do you think?
Yeah, I think we need to be really careful with how much we how far we leap ahead with the idea that young people clearly preferred one candidate to the other. So point number one, this wasn't a vote for the DPP by these young voters. In every focus group that I did, and also I think a lot of the ones that my research assistants did, the young people said, I'm voting for Tsai Ing-wen because I can't vote for Kuo-yu. But don't put me down in your book, as a DPP supporter, because I'm voting for the person, not the party. Political parties are all alike. In a very short span of time, the DPP has become the establishment for a lot of young people. They view themselves as standing outside of partisan competition. And so the idea that, the DPP can kind of count on the support of young voters, I think they need to be really careful to not make that assumption or take it for granted. I totally agree with Tom that the KMT is not doing anything to make that harder for the DPP, but it's not a partisan commitment. What it is, I think, is really kind of two things. First of all, the Tsai Ing-wen feels to young voters like someone who is much more pragmatic and much more able to defend the core interests of Taiwan in the face of PRC pressure. And they're very focused on that, not because they love Taiwan or they have some kind of ideological attachment to the idea of Taiwan. They believe in Taiwan as their homeland. They think China means the PRC, and that's because the PRC leadership has defined China as the PRC internationally in a way that just completely locks out the ROC. But at the same time, they don't particularly reject the ROC as a label. And they kind of like the idea that Tsai Ing-wen has co-opted the ROC label from the KMT to kind of settle this issue a little bit. But I think a big part of Han Kuo-yu's problem with young voters, they worry about, that he might be a little bit squishy in the face of PRC pressure, that he might not be able to stand up to it so well. But fundamentally, they saw him as the embodiment of old people in politics. He's your crazy uncle. It's one thing to say maybe he could be mayor of a city, but he's just not what Taiwan needs in the 21st century as a national leader. They didn't like the way he talked. They didn't like the way he talked to women, the way he talked about women, the way he talked about the so-called new Taiwanese people living in Taiwan who have come from elsewhere. They didn't like the way he talked about young people. So it's a lot about Han Kuo-yu and maybe less a referendum on kind of the policy positions of the KMT versus the DPP.
I'm glad you went there, because that's what I was going to get at, is why young people were either repulsed by one candidate or attracted to another candidate. And part of it may just be familiarity with Tsai Ing-wen. They've seen her on this national stage for some time. They know how she's responded. Han Kuo-yu is new and perhaps that crazy uncle. Ray, is that what your students think?
Pretty much, yeah. I would say my student, or most of the young people I have spoke with, they have this kind of very strong rejection to Han Kuo-yu's personal characteristic. I think they are also motivated, especially by the recent event, especially from Hong Kong, when they see the importance of the national identity and the possible threat from China. So that's really aroused their compassion for politics, because, well, in the past, most of the young people actually don't care about politics that much. So I think the news, especially about Han Kuo-yu, the negative news about Han Kuo-yu online, and also the news about Hong Kong, who represent the threat of possible Chinese unification, which really make young people to turn out to vote this time. So we see a great number of young people actually go out to vote. That is really surprising and, in a way, very encouraging.
Ray, thank you. Yeah, participation by young people is something that we certainly hope we see more of here in the United States. But thanks for focusing on this, because part of the story of the 2020 election was a return to passion. You had participation shoot up. 3 out of 4 eligible voters did vote, which is a remarkable statistic. And you've highlighted Hong Kong as one of these motivating factors. Dan, you're based now in Hong Kong. What do you think?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, when we were at the DPP rally in Taipei on Friday night, Clay, I'm sure other people here were there too. I mean, the DPP was making liberal use of scary Hong Kong imagery in the videos that showed up on the huge screen behind. And it's only natural. I mean, you're talking about a young people-led, maybe not revolutionary, but strong protest movement over here in the summer, fall, and into the winter of 2019 and beyond now, it looks like. Clearly, if you're a young person in Taiwan, really if you're a young person anywhere, but especially in Taiwan, you're going to identify with those young people across the strait here in Hong Kong protesting against the CCP. And it really must have brought home in a very clear and compelling way the dangers of accepting one country, two systems. And you know, Xi Jinping last January 2nd, 2019, effectively defined the 1992 consensus as one country, two systems. So maybe in the past, I mean, actually, I think they had actually done that before in years and decades past, but not as clearly and as obviously. So, I mean, Han Kuo-yu and Ma Ying-jeou, people on the Kuomintang stage on Thursday night, openly promoted the 1992 consensus concept. And that's basically saying, since Xi Jinping's speech, okay, we're going to accept, we're going to move toward one country, two systems. I mean, I know Han Kuo-yu said one country, two systems over my dead body. He also said that. But the implication now, more than ever, of accepting the 1992 consensus is accepting the Hong Kong model, and that doesn't seem to be working very well these days.
No, thanks. Tom, you said that the Kuomintang strategy is patience. Let's just wait until these voters are older, and then they will come over to our way of thinking. I was wondering if you had conversations with the DPP about its deliberate attempt to bring in young voters, who, as Ray pointed out, turned out in record numbers.
Well, the DPP actually at their headquarters had it looked like a small park, in fact, with activities and programs that were really targeted to engaging young people. I mean, quite simple-minded things like ring tosses and such, where you would play games and talk about politics and share your political experience. So they had a very different engagement strategy indeed. They were also, as has already been mentioned, they were actively focused on using the experience of Hong Kong as a lens by which young people could understand the importance of the election that was occurring in Taiwan. I would note that the enthusiasm wasn't just for local Taiwanese youth either. I had current and former students flying back from the United States, from Canada, from places in Asia like Singapore, so that they could vote in the election. There was tremendous excitement by them. And I think one of the issues that really resonated with these highly globalized Taiwanese young people was the Marriage Act. And while it was seen as an argument by many of the KMT supporters as a reason to oppose the DPP, for young people, it was a sign that Taiwan had entered into that group of very advanced, very forward-thinking nations, and that this was something that they were fiercely proud of and eager to protect, regardless of their own sexual preference. So I think it was a great difference in generations, and quite candidly, based upon what's been said already about Hong Kong, I think the big loser in the election is Xi Jinping, who seemed to have overplayed his strategy of resistance in Hong Kong and now seems to have made it much more difficult to engage Taiwanese youth.
An excellent question. And we're going to move to cross-strait relations, what strategies Beijing might employ. But I'd like to stay on the question of marriage equality for a moment, because that was one of these big issues. But it wasn't actually, I remember seeing a rainbow flag at the DPP rally, but I don't remember explicit references to it. This was something that had happened and was celebrated, but it was something where young people, of course, took the lead. Shelley, in your interviews, did people turn to marriage equality, being able to have marry the person they love regardless of gender?
Yeah, definitely. It came up in a lot of our interviews, as did Hong Kong. And I specifically instructed my research assistants not to mention Hong Kong, not to ask about it, so that we could see whether it came up spontaneously. And it definitely did. I think for young people in Taiwan, marriage equality is obvious. It's straightforward. It's like, why would we not do this? And I think that for a lot of young people, it was kind of the first time that they disagreed with their older generation. You know, they were kind of shocked to learn that parents or grandparents were not in support. And this goes for KMT leaning as well as DPP leaning youth. You know, just it's similar to the US. Marriage equality is just a kind of baseline preference for young people. But I think what's really interesting is how the DPP didn't use it, because I think you're right. The last night rally in Taipei, and Tsai Ing-wen had a series of last night rallies working her way up the island over the course of that day. So I don't know what she said in Kaohsiung or Taichung or even Banqiao, which is a suburb of Taipei City. But in her downtown rally, she listed a bunch of accomplishments and she said, I got it done. I got it done. Well, the big applause line for sure was marriage equality from that crowd. But we didn't hear her campaigning on that issue a lot. And the reason is that it was controversial. It was actually, marriage equality is not supported by a majority of Taiwanese. They had a referendum barely 13 months ago that makes that clear. So she was very much sort of soft pedaling that issue. Moreover, it's not necessarily an issue that some of the core supporters of the DPP are comfortable with. So I think what's most interesting about this election from the standpoint of the marriage equality thing, I don't think marriage equality hurt her with core supporters one iota. Some of the places that are most full of the sort of deep green, older, more socially conservative DPP voters voted overwhelmingly for Tsai. They reelected or elected DPP legislators. So I think what we learned from this is that this was an issue that they were willing to go against her on the referendum. But when it comes down to, are you going to support the KMT, which shares your view on marriage equality, or the DPP, which shares your view on everything else that matters to you, they went back to the DPP.
So I think you're absolutely right. Taiwan sort of backed into marriage equality, not unlike the United States, involving court decisions and then administrative kinds of changes. And so across the younger spectrum, people may have been on board, but as you say, it's not uniformly popular. One last question focusing on domestic politics. And I'd like to ask about the role of economics in the campaign and in deciding who people voted for. And on this, maybe we should go ahead and ask Ray if you might say something about the economic platforms that the two sides, the two leading sides put forward, and how people of various generations, various locations, various lines of work may have responded.
Okay, so since 2016, I think the DPP's major economical policy will be the new southbound policy. So basically try to moving the Taiwanese investment and business and company from China to Southeast Asia. And they spend a lot of effort on this. We haven't seen a great result yet, but that kind of the trend. When the KMT basically staying like Han Kuo-yu keeps saying, the money come in and the export come out. So that's kind of the KMT's tradition. So basically doing more business with China. So I guess this become the foundation for both parties. They stick with their old plans, and unfortunately in this election, economics or the cross-strait policy doesn't come out become the topic. So they keep fighting with the characters, fighting with the Wang Guogan, those kind of really identificational issues. So I think the economics become kind of left off out of this election, but they stick with their traditional routes.
Thank you. Dan, you and I went down to Kaohsiung and we met with the government there, led at that point by the deputy mayor, and he highlighted economic boom for Kaohsiung. He talked about especially rising trade, and particularly in agriculture. He talked about exports going up by a factor of 3 in just a single year. And you've been following the southbound policy efforts to cultivate relations in Southeast Asia. Dan, what did you see on the economic side of this campaign and this election?
Well, you know, in the first year of the Trump trade war with China, or the tariff war with China, you had a number of Taiwanese investors come back and invest again in Taiwan. So I think the economic growth rate was a bit higher, not dramatically higher, but a bit higher than people expected it to be. And so I think they're able to reassure themselves, actually decoupling from China might not be that painful. But my own thinking is this is likely to be temporary, that in the long run, not having economic relations with China is going to hurt the Taiwan economy. I mean, even I read today, I think in the George Will column, actually, that's been circulating about Taiwan, a very useful column, that 4% of Taiwan GDP comes from tourism. I mean, Shelley could probably confirm that, or Ray, I'm not sure about that. In any case, you've had almost total cessation in the flow of tourists from China across the strait. That's probably not going to have a huge macroeconomic impact, but it is going to hurt specific groups in specific places. The pineapple cake industry, for example, is probably hurting, and others too in the hotel restaurant industry. And so we're hurting in Hong Kong now, actually, as a result of that. So in the long run, Taiwan, in pursuing the new southbound policy with less economically developed countries, may achieve a certain amount of decoupling, and that may be satisfying and reassuring and increase a sense of security, but there will be an economic cost. And so people there will just have to decide whether this is worth the cost. But the other economic factor in the election is, of course, Taiwan's pension reform did hurt older people pretty seriously in some cases who formerly worked in the government, the military, or the educational sector. And I think we saw lots and lots and lots of those people. I think they were the backbone of the Han Kuo-yu supporters, the people who look back nostalgically on the glory days of the Republic of China, the whole concept, including not just the identifying with Chinese history and culture, but also the specific benefits they derived under KMT rule. And clearly Tsai, for obvious important fiscal reasons, was going after those people's pensions, and that I think probably really needed to be done, but it hurt those people in a serious way. And so they threw their lot in with Han Kuo-yu, and then it didn't work out.
Yeah, the budget people from the previous administration, from the Ma administration, they were aware of the ticking time bomb represented by pension and talked about the need for doing something. But it was the Tsai administration that did this. Partly, as you've already identified, they saw the political costs as bearable and the financial need as vital. And so they made that hard calculation to do that. Tom, in your discussions, did economics play a role?
Yeah, I would echo some of what Dan said. It came up in conversations with people like our bus driver, women who ran small shops that we stopped in tourist areas, who explicitly talked about how Tsai's policy had provoked China to stop the flow of Chinese day tourists and had dramatic impact on their businesses. The other place where we heard it, though, was from young people who were anxious about the future and the sustainability of an economy that will be able to create opportunity for better educated young Taiwanese citizens. And so, as is the case in many other countries around the world, young people were concerned that the economy in Taiwan favored the people who were already rich and wasn't creating enough opportunity for young people. And I think that becomes a real challenge. If you're going to keep young people engaged and keep them optimistic about their future, you need to assure them that there is a path to economic well-being. The research I've seen on Hong Kong says that's one of the big factors that leads to the unhappiness in Hong Kong as well. That, well, the extradition bill is one thing that motivated those protests. The declining living conditions, or the perception that their lives won't be as good as those of their parents and grandparents, was also motivating protests. So I think this is a real concern, regardless of who won this election.
Yeah, it's long been highlighted that perhaps the benefits of economic integration with China flow disproportionately to a select group.
Right.
And mapping that out, I think greater research is needed on this, but definitely that is the perception. And so that weighs heavily in or should weigh heavily in the policy making. Now, Shelley, you talked with young people and you've been looking at this question, and at a recent meeting, you highlighted the inequality and the generational nature of inequality in Taiwan. Could you say something about economics and this election outcome?
Yeah, I think there is a very strong perception of inequality in Taiwan, but it is, the data suggests that it's not the sort of, there's some degree of kind of what we would think of as traditional class inequality, but that the biggest gap is actually generational. So at least in terms of wealth. So a great deal of wealth is owned by the older generation, whereas the younger generation don't have wealth of their own, and also their salaries are pretty low. And so they don't see how they're going to generate wealth. Their standard of living is propped up by the fact that the older generation are their parents and grandparents. So they live well, but they are anxious about their future. And I got to say, Clay, my kids feel that way. Right. I think this is a feature of post-industrial capitalism in the 21st century, and we got to figure out how to deal with it. One of the virtues that Taiwan has in the face of this challenge is that it has a great deal of financial capital, a lot of it earned as Taiwanese traditional manufacturers that were small and medium-sized in Taiwan became gigantic when they were able to leverage the value in the Taiwanese labor, the PRC labor market in the 90s and 2000s. So they've generated a lot of financial capital. Taiwan also has incredible human capital. Sometimes people say too much. They say, oh, we have this overeducated workforce. I think financial capital plus human capital equals exactly what you need for another phase of development. So, I think what Taiwan needs to do is to get the policy mix right to encourage the owners of financial capital to invest productively. So not in the stock market or real estate, but in actual productive enterprises that can put young people to work. That's a little hard to do. And it's especially hard to do in Taiwan, where if there's one thing everybody has in common, it's that they think that taxes are the enemy. So I was in a meeting at KMT headquarters with young KMT activists who were so frustrated with the KMT, so convinced that the way forward was to identify with Han Kuo-yu's core constituency, which are working class and lower middle class people who feel like they've been left behind. And, we gotta change our economic policies to be more favorable to working class people. And we said, well, how, what's the answer? And they said, tax cuts. They have no idea how to put together the kind of social democratic policy framework that would actually answer the needs of people who are not capitalists in Taiwan. So I think that's a big challenge for everybody.
Well, one of the striking things at the DPP rally was the pride that the premier expressed in having reduced taxes so dramatically. But those,
right, while increasing spending on everything.
That's right.
That's right.
That's right. Fiscal responsibility was not the line we heard from either political party. They weren't pushing in those directions. Let's leave the question of domestic politics now and switch. We've already touched a little bit on the cross-strait relation and how this Tsai's reelection and a big victory, how that may affect the relationship between China and Taiwan. And Tom, I know that you and some of the others visited the Mainland Affairs Council, since those folks are still going to be responsible for this. What is your takeaway? What do you think looms largest in that relationship?
I think there's a significant anxiety about what China's next moves might be, including conversations that said they may see some desire to act quickly before this separatist notion gets more deeply ingrained into the mindset of the next generation of Taiwanese. There's also
if you don't mind my interruption for a second, that's one of the questions. Was this a separatist vote? And the vast majority of Taiwanese would probably say no. It was a vote to stay the course. But I'm not in Beijing, it's perceived differently.
That way. There's also a great concern about Chinese intervention through disinformation, trying to affect the outcome of the election. And so there's a kind of vigilance that the government acutely feels now that I suspect is going to be translated into more consideration of new weapon systems and new programs to counter different forms of Chinese intervention into Taiwanese affairs. The last thing I would mention is that at the DPP rally that we attended, there were actually young people waving huge American flags. And I can't think of any other country in the world right now where young people would be waving American flags. But Taiwan is one such place. And I think there is a concern that Taiwanese youth may put too much faith in the United States. We have a very mercurial and unpredictable president at the moment. And I think it would be a mistake for Taiwan to think that the United States would be eager to respond to any form of Chinese aggression against Taiwan. And so that was a topic that was discussed in great detail in many of the meetings that I attended.
Well, and especially your delegation, there were, it was an American delegation. And so I can imagine
we were led by
government
a
officials.
retired brigadier general.
There you are. And we're going to come back to the U.S. Taiwan relationship in just a minute, but let's continue on the cross-strait relationship. And Tom, you mentioned disinformation. Dan, you and I went and spoke with one of the researchers who's been looking into this and trying to find ways to combat it. Can you share some of what we learned?
Well, we learned that people in Taiwan, whether in civil society or in government, are very aware of the disinformation and fake news problem. I mean, it may have played a role in helping Han Kuo-yu become re-elected as mayor of Kaohsiung in fall of 2018. We don't know exactly what caused that. So Taiwan voters, though, obviously have learned to see through a lot of the fake news and disinformation, and it doesn't seem to have the sort of profound impact on them that we might otherwise expect, which is actually very encouraging from a global history perspective, right? Because fake news played a big role in Trump's election, I think, in the fall of 2016. Russian-originated fake news has played a role in poisoning European politics, so it's important. But back to the broader cross-strait relationship. So to me, it looks like actually, although I hate to disagree with you, Clay, that the election actually was effectively a referendum on the 1992 consensus, one country, two systems, and even the Republic of China concept. I mean, it wasn't explicitly a referendum, but in effect it was. I think that's how it'll be seen in the KMT and in the PRC for sure. And so what it looks like when you stand back is that the 25-year Chinese strategy for absorbing Taiwan, for using carrots and sticks to absorb Taiwan is in tatters. I mean, And even though I just said Taiwan needs to have good economic relations with China to continue to be as prosperous as it otherwise might be, even though that's the truth and that's the case, Chinese economic growth is slowing dramatically. And so they can't look forward in China to returning to the days of the 2000s when Taiwanese exports to the mainland were increasing by double digits every year, huge flow of Taiwan investment across the strait. So they can't rely on that kind of economic dynamism anymore to convince Taiwanese to go along with their plans. They can't rely on fake news anymore, or we'll see, maybe they'll adjust the fake news strategy. They can't hoodwink people ideologically. So the only thing left is military power. And so, but actually, ironically, I'm pretty optimistic that they won't use military power. And you know why? Because I think they believe their own propaganda and ideology in the PRC. I don't think they realize that their rise, their national rise in relative power is stalling. They probably think, I mean, I think they do think that 10 years, 20 years down the road, they'll be even stronger than Taiwan, relatively speaking, than they are now, and stronger than the US. So I think, certainly I hope, they'll think we might as well just wait patiently and bide our time, go back to biding our time, but actually showing off their capabilities.
Okay, we'll come back to the, whether or not China is going to continue to rise through all sorts of programs that we have coming up. But let me go, Ray, if you recently spoke about the cross-strait relationship, and you mentioned that you have a lot of discussions with people on the at the Taiwan Affairs Office in Beijing, other people on the mainland, and you asked questions about, you had a sense that they know pretty well that most people in Taiwan are not in favor of any sort of political joining with the mainland. Can you speak to where you think the cross-strait relationship is and where it might go?
Yes, thank you. I think there is the impression that China really think Taiwan invocation is very important. However, from my impression from all those visits to China, those conversations with the Chinese scholar officers and the people who have the say on this, well, I would say they talk about Taiwan's affairs more in line with their relationship with the United States. So this is always, well, Taiwan issue is important, but it's not as important as their relationship with the United States, with Russia, with Japan. So from this forward, I will disagree with what Dan said about their confidence, the reason for them holding their military action against Taiwan, because they are confident about their rise. I think they don't attack Taiwan, but also because they really don't need this kind of trouble at this moment, because they have much more urgent thing to do. Their own economical growth, their relationship with the United States, and many those kind of things. So I think we cannot forget that China is a big country, and especially the people live there thinking they are a big country. So they have this kind of empire attitude that we are big, we have to do bigger things, right? Taiwan is a tiny little place. So let's just keep it in the corner and don't make any further trouble, then that's okay. So that's kind of my impression and my understanding about the cross-strait relation. That's kind of the fundamental agenda about Beijing is to keep Taiwan at this stage. And so from this point, they kind of in line with the DPP because they all want to keep the status quo.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, that Beijing necessarily is preoccupied with keeping things going on the mainland, and there's enough of a challenge to do that, especially in the midst of tougher trade circumstances, conflict with the US. We had the phase 1 arrangement signed today, but the friction certainly continues. And the cost of any kind of military action would be phenomenal around the world, but also within China. I'm not certain that many Chinese parents are ready for their children to be part of the body count in that situation. Shelley, you are officially a cross-strait fellow. tell us about the cross-strait relationship.
Yeah, I just want to call attention to something Ray said that I think is really important, which is that both the DPP and the KMT fundamentally are taking the position, preserve the status quo. The KMT is not looking to deliver unification anytime in the foreseeable future. And the DPP, I would argue, has basically, as a party, given up on the idea of formal juridical independence. So to me, if we think about the difference between what Beijing wants, which is unification, and what Beijing needs, which is to ensure that Taiwan does not force its hand by declaring independence, and then which would require a very strong response, probably a military response from Beijing. As long as that doesn't happen, while I know that there are pressures in the PRC to make progress on unification, the fact of the matter is that kind of this situation or this problem is relatively stable and relatively neutralized. And I think that Tsai Ing-wen's development of this kind of portmanteau concept for the national name of ROC Taiwan is evidence of the degree to which the DPP is stepping back from at least the sort of formal expression of an independence sentiment. And she doesn't just use that when she's talking to the PRC, right? She used that at her election eve rally. She said ROC Taiwan, which is a big change from the past. I would also just point to a meeting I had with the State Building Party, which is the most pro-independence party that participated in this election. That independence is one of the central tenets of the State Building Party, which is the Jijindang, for those who are, more familiar with the Chinese name.
It's in the name of the party.
Right. So what they said was, we know that independence is not going to happen right now. Why are we a pro-independence party participating in this election? Because we want to keep the issue on the agenda to anchor the other end of the political spectrum so that the center doesn't just shift farther and farther away from independence. And because we believe that someday in the future, the space for an independent Taiwan could open up, and we want to be ready. If that's what independence is in Taiwan today, I think Beijing should be doing the happy dance in the streets of Zhongnanhai. Figure we've got Taiwan where we need it to be, even if it's not moving to where we want it to be, and move on to all those other issues that I totally agree with Ray are vitally important for the survival of the PRC state.
Yeah. I haven't been invited inside Zhongnanhai anytime recently. And so I don't know that anybody's dancing in the streets at this electoral outcome, but I think you're right. I think that Beijing is, for the most part, satisfied to not have to address any sort of movement in the direction of full-on independence. Name changes, things like that. Tsai Ing-wen, from her first speech in 2016, said, "I'm the president of the Republic of China, Taiwan. I am observing the Republic of China Constitution," all of those kinds of assurances. And so there's been an effort to just move this off the front of the stove to one of the back burners. Let's switch for just a minute or two on the U.S. Taiwan relationship. And audience members, you've been posting your questions. We're going to get to those questions in just a moment. So let me go first to Dan. Tom's already said some things about the U.S. Taiwan relationship. Dan, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think the U.S. Taiwan relationship is in a good place. People, when we visited the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, you and I, Clay, with others in our group, they actually told us relations have never been better under Trump. Of course, on the other hand, some very pro-Taiwan officials in the Trump administration have recently departed. John Bolton, and then later in the fall in December, Randy Schreiber. So it's still too early to know exactly, what the implications of those departures will be for Taiwan. I think it's going to be interesting to see whether Trump moves any more in the direction of accommodating Xi Jinping in the now 10 months or whatever it is leading up to his reelection effort. It's possible he'll do something, become more accommodating with regard to Taiwan. I mean, I don't know if he even thinks that much about Taiwan. But I was also heartened that Joe Biden, still, I think, the leading candidate on the Democratic side, issued a tweet congratulating Tsai Ing-wen and saying we hoped we actually should move toward having closer relations with Taiwan. So I think the U.S.-Taiwan relationship has never been better. I mean, and at the popular level too, there is all kinds of support for Tsai Ing-wen. I mean, Tsai Ing-wen is a compelling, and the whole DPP movement now, very compelling internationally. I mean, for some of the reasons Tom said, in terms of accepting same-sex marriage, and we talked about the decline in PRC tourists going to Taiwan the last couple of years, but actually been a huge upsurge in Northeast, Southeast Asian, European, and American and other tourists, especially younger people going to Taiwan. So I think Taiwan's image internationally has never been better. I think it's in a good place in terms of relations with the US.
Ray, would you agree with that? Are these golden times in the U.S.-Taiwan relationship?
I would say yes, but also has some concern on it because many people here, especially from the international relation field, they feel that, well, this is just temporary. This is just a bargaining chip. Taiwan is a bargaining chip between Trump and Xi Jinping. So after they reach agreement, then everything will be gone. So, but I think I agree with Tom on this because we see very obvious participation and also encouraged language from the AIT, the American Institute in Taiwan, who have been very actively engaging with DPP and endorsing its policy on this. So, but I also believe that from the military standpoint, the growing cooperation between the Taiwanese and American military who are preparing for possible future war is kind of a long-term trend. So both sides thinking cooperation is the best way to deter Chinese invasion. So I believe this part of the cooperation between Taiwan and American will continue. But beyond that, I think the more diplomatic collaboration, those kind of very friendly gesture and languages probably will disappear after a while, yes.
One of the striking things for me at the U.S. China Institute, we've taken several groups of middle school and high school teachers to both the People's Republic and to Taiwan. And for the most part, these teachers had very little sense of anything about Taiwan. They knew where it was on the map, but they didn't have a deep background in Taiwan's history, its economic rise, its democratization. But almost instantly, within the first day, they came to see certain commonalities in terms of values, in terms of priorities, things like that. And so for many people in the United States, Taiwan is not a bargaining chip. Taiwan is a real place with real people and people that many Americans feel very sympathetic, very similar to. Tom, I'm going to come back to you in just a second for final words on this question, but Shelley, what do you think?
Yeah, I think what's most important is to kind of remember that we need to be careful to differentiate between Trump himself. Dan's characterization of him, I think, is right on, and the rest of the US administration and also Congress and as you pointed out, the American people. So I think Tsai Ing-wen has been very clever or very smart about treating Trump himself with great caution and maintaining a very consistent but also kind of below the radar position for Taiwan. Because I think the most dangerous thing for Taiwan is just to become something that's working in his mind, because when an issue comes into his mind, we don't know what will come out of his tweet. So I think Taiwan has to be cautious about two things. One is the possibility of becoming a target for Trump's unpredictable policymaking. And then the other is becoming overly comfortable with its role in the the growing U.S.-China strategic separation or even competition. Because I learned a new phrase recently in Taiwan, ma qianzu. It means the infantry soldiers who get put in front of the cavalry, which is to say the guys who are definitely going to die. Taiwan does not want to be in that position for the US. And I think there are people in the US who are so focused on defeating China that they're forgetting that Taiwan is its own place and Taiwan's people have their own interests, which may not be the same as the interest of the US in somehow batting back the Chinese rise.
Yeah, Taiwan is definitely not just a tool for somebody to use in some geostrategic way. Tom, some final words on the U.S.-Taiwan relationship, and then a shout out to our audience members. Several of you have already posted questions. We're going to start to ask those questions in just a moment. If anyone wants to add, please do so now. Tom?
Well, one thing I would note is China has just launched its second aircraft carrier. And while it's not fully operational yet, with 2 aircraft carriers, China is for the first time going to be able to really make vulnerable both Taiwan's east and west coasts, which fundamentally changes the defensive strategy that Taiwan has to use and makes far greater demands on its military resources. The second thing is with many more planes operational, China is going to be able to play games invading Taiwanese airspace so that Taiwan has to continually scramble its own jets to escort them out. Even if it doesn't lead to a miscalculation that escalates into some kind of unhappy event, it's going to be very taxing and demanding on Taiwanese resources to keep planes in the air that often and to keep so many pilots up there engaging Chinese fighters is going to be very costly for Taiwan. And so one element of the relationship is going to have to be how the US provides military support to discourage China from risking going too far without encouraging Taiwan to become complacent in its own defense. And I think that's going to be a bit of a challenge. There is an acute awareness in the US about China's strategic emphasis on expanding its military capabilities, of course, throughout the South China Sea, but it's also flooding the area around the Diaoyu Islands with every kind of Navy vessel and aircraft to engage the Japanese. And all this activity has placed the entire region on alert. And so I think that's a very real criteria, and we don't want miscalculation. We don't want any kind of accidental incursion. I think that's really imperative. I think Shelley and Dan are correct when they say that the U.S.-China relationship is solid. I think it's there in both the Democratic and the Republican parties. My anxiety is our unpredictable president, not necessarily the hierarchy around him, either in the State Department or in the military. Although I would note that there have been major changes at state, and it's not the same State Department that it would have been 10 years ago. So I think that's a major consideration as well.
No, thank you. And I know, Tom, that you have a research project underway right now looking at media attention to the rivalry in the South China Sea. You've already worked on the East China Sea. And so in terms of American strategic thinking, and you work with the Defense Department with some of their communications questions, I was wondering what your sense of the American military, is it mainly a fear of the complacency that you mentioned, or is there anything else at work?
Well, I think the U.S. military is always concerned about burden sharing, right? So we don't want to be responsible for incurring all the costs and obligations of the defense, even of our closest allies. And secondly, I think there's a deep concern about just how far China's ambitions may take them, and the places where those those contests become most real. And everything we know about a strategy to engage China is that it's going to be a quick escalation strategy because we don't want a land war in Asia. And that's, of course, fearsome because that it's a strategy to try to prevent fleet forces from communicating with Beijing or with their command. And since China has placed most of its nuclear weapons on submarines, it's not a happy picture to have submarine captains floating about trying to decide use it or lose it because they can't connect to their commanders anymore. And so there's just a whole series of very frightening scenarios if it ever does come to conflict. And hopefully we will never see such a conflict.
Thank you. We're going to turn now to some of the questions submitted by our viewers, by people who are joining the conversation by typing in their questions. And I'd like to combine a couple of questions submitted by these folks and to look at human rights. So we've touched on Hong Kong and how that may have driven some of the results, but more broadly, the human rights story in China, including the horrific situation in Xinjiang. And so I was wondering if any of you in your discussions or in your reading saw that there was particular attention to civil liberties. Of course, Taiwanese enjoy civil liberties, and that's a big reason why they want to preserve the autonomy of Taiwan. But any members of our panel, I don't know if you have a response to where human rights is in this discussion.
May I?
Please, Ray.
Oh, yes. Well, human right is my concern as my study. So I think there is the good trend in Taiwan, especially since 2016. DPP has become more vocal about the human rights in China. Well, they especially recently talk about a lot of things about Hong Kong. I think they see the benefit about concerning human rights in general as so they promote this idea called the value alliance, so alliance with the other democratic societies. So I see this very healthy growing trend that the government become more concerned. But I would say they still very reluctant about accepting, for example, the political refugees, the asylum seekers, for many different reasons. One time I talked to mainland affairs officers, they told me, well, even we agree that the law, the new refugee law is necessary, but it won't pass in the legislation yuan. So we couldn't do much about it. But I would say this kind of a negative attitude toward immigration in general, especially people from mainland China, become an issue. I hope in the future we can slowly to adjust.
Well, maybe in a web discussion somewhere down the road, we can come to and focus on this migration question, because it is an important one for society, for the economic future of Taiwan, and that's definitely one of these issues. And I know, Ray, that you work with various NGOs. You're studying civil society, the development of civil society. And a couple of you raised the marriage equality question. And of course, that's a civil rights, that's a human rights question. I don't know if our other panelists wanted to weigh in on this. Go ahead, Shelley.
Yeah, just in relation to the Xinjiang question, I think Taiwan is really vexed about how to differentiate itself from the PRC really effectively on the issue of Islam and welcoming Muslim people and Islamic ways of life into Taiwan. So Taiwan has this very strong policy of promoting itself as a Muslim-friendly place. I saw lots of halal restaurants, lots of toilet facilities equipped for Islamic practices, to be a little overly personal perhaps, but at the same time, the idea that people from Southeast Asia, for whom this Muslim-friendly identity is really being designed, could become full members of Taiwan society, that's still a heavy lift. And in conversations asking specifically about this, the answer is often, yeah, we want like people with really excellent job skills from Southeast Asia to become immigrants to Taiwan. But the real bulk of the Southeast Asian population that is in Taiwan, who are working, most of the men as construction or manufacturing, manual labor, most of the women as domestic labor, that's a short-term job thing for them, and they're going to go back. So, you know, they're not all the way there in understanding that being open to immigration, being open to people from the outside, doesn't always just mean adding what you see as the cream of the crop to your population. It also may mean being genuinely open to people that, you know, you might not previously have imagined.
Right. Moving in the direction of more inclusivity. Certainly you've got, you know, the tolerance and, you know, the remittance economy that exists, but full membership, being able to help choose a president, for example, that's maybe down the road a bit. If you don't mind, we've only got a couple minutes. I wanted to raise a question that one of our participants raised via the Q&A board, and that had to do with a last-minute revelation. This fellow in Australia who claims to have worked for Chinese intelligence comes out with a story that involves a senior Kuomintang party official and raising this kind of question. This speaks to both the flow of information, the timing of this, the fact that it occurs outside the boundaries of Taiwan and then funnels back in. I would like any of you who would choose to comment on that, the question about Wang Liqiang, Alex Tsai, and this sort of thing. Everybody's racing to jump in on this one.
The only thing I'll say about that is that I certainly heard about that in conversations while I was there. This kind of news breaking late is fairly typical in campaigns. Lots of times these stories feed conspiracy narratives, and there were conspiracy narratives, you know, by the dozens that were circulating in the closing days of the campaign here. And I didn't think that was particularly unusual. They get hastened by social media networks where like-minded people spread these kinds of stories and often don't accurately report on what in the end turns out to be the case. So I'm less focused on the substance of it than how it works as a tactic politically in a heated campaign.
That's probably what we should, where we should leave that particular topic. One of our other questioners asked for some additional discussion about these newer parties, and particularly the party established by Taipei Mayor Ing-wen and its place. It's how it fits. Is it going to be aligned with the DPP, or is it the basis for something else?
Yeah, I think this is really interesting. I did not think that TPP would do as well as they did. And, you know, they got a bunch of PR list seats, and they will be a presence in the legislature. And the graphic that you showed shows them seated between the KMT and the DPP, which is perfect. I think it's very hard to anticipate how they will actually legislate, in part because their message, at least, is that they don't have any preferences, right? That they are about good government, smart decision making. You know, it's a very sort of postmodern political party. We don't really stand for anything. We just want to make the right decision. I think that they could not have held that position and had a presidential candidate right? A presidential candidate has to answer certain fundamental questions. So I think that's why in the end, Kuo-yu did not become, or that's part of the reason why Kuo-yu did not become a presidential candidate as many people had expected. But I think they're a wild card, and it's probably a good thing that DPP still has a majority without them, because I think if they actually deliver on their promise to the voters, they're going to vacillate back and forth between the two major parties in how they vote, depending upon the content of a particular legislative proposal.
Yeah, that was a very striking result. And whether or not, the Taiwan People's Party is going to be completely situational, depending on the situation, we just don't know. But its success and the votes that went to other parties speak to a dissatisfaction, at least among many Taiwanese, with the existing two dominant parties. That clearly they preferred Tsai to Han Kuo-yu, no question about that. But with regard to these well-established parties, many voters seem to be looking for something else. Tom, you wanted to jump in.
Well, I was just going to say that when we went to actually visit with that party, about the only specific thing they told us is we believe in science. And literally, they had no other real message. Good government, and we believe in science.
So do I. That's a great thing. Shelley?
Yeah, on the politics of it, I just wanted to point out a couple things. First of all, your point just now about the declining support for the major parties. In the party list voting 4 years ago, the DPP got about 44% of the party list, KMT about 33%. This year they tied basically at 33%. They were just a few 100,000 votes apart. So big drop in the willingness of voters to, affirm the DPP. And even if you add up the DPP and other like-minded parties, including the New Power Party and the State Building Party and the Green Party, they still fell pretty far short of where they were 4 years ago. And I did some math, and what I think is that the majority of the TPP, so Kuo-yu's party vote, actually came out of the DPP's, what 4 years ago would have been the DPP's party vote. So I think a lot of people are really trying to use that party vote to send a message, DPP, don't take us for granted.
Dan, Ray, would you like to weigh in on the place of these other parties, what this split ticket represents? Go ahead, Ray.
I would say, don't forget one thing is Kuo-yu already say he will run for the president in 2024. So no matter what, even Shelley correctly pointed out that his party has no position. But also don't forget that his political identity is much more closer to the DPP. So for sure, he is going to become a very worrisome challenger in the 2024 election for DPP for sure. And so I think he's a smart guy. So he strategically chosen this kind of not so blue, not so green position. Not to mention that he keeps saying, well, he has very good relationship with Beijing, right? So it almost looked like he has this kind of position. The Communist Party, Kuomintang, and DPP all has something good about him. So I think he strategically chooses this kind of central position. So I think many, especially young voters, actually accept that. So I think in terms of the slip vote, in terms of this popularity, 11% he got, I think that's kind of his good result for him. So I think another angle to look at this is after this election, the Dupai, the hardcore independency people, the faction inside DPP is going to challenge Tsai Ing-wen very quickly. So for those people, when they try to divide the DPP inside, then Kuo-yu and other smaller party, the pan-green small party, are going to gain something in the future for sure. So I was expecting that the next big election in 2 years from now, the local election is going to be very, very heated. And we are going to see the smaller party, especially from the Pan-Green side, are going to become very vocal and very vicious about the elections.
Yeah, so perhaps some of these TPP, the Taiwan People's Party voters, were signaling that they wish Mayor Ko was on the ballot, or they're trying to encourage. It's hard, for us to know. And you've anticipated a couple of the other questions that people have asked, which is, what is the future? So Tsai is definitely the dominant figure in the DPP. That's much less clear for the Kuomintang and for these others. But we're going to have to save that for some future discussion. I want to, first of all, thank all of the folks who have been viewing, those of you who raised questions. Some of you asked questions about Chinese politics, and we'll save that for another time. But thank you all for tuning in. And thanks especially to our panelists. And I'd like to give each of them a chance for any final comments that you would like to offer. Shelley, why don't we open with you?
Yeah, I just want to go back to the photos that you showed of the vote counting at the beginning of the session, and just say how incredibly moving and beautiful the Taiwanese actual voting process and vote counting process is. I vote in North Carolina on a machine that I have real questions. I'm not a conspiracy theory kind of person. But I have real questions about whether that machine is hooked up to anything. And there is no way that anyone could ever verify that the votes that people cast were actually delivered in an honest manner to the counting station. I also live in a state that has been the subject of year upon year upon year of gerrymandering, legal fights. We had a congressional election invalidated because of actual fraud.
Right.
So, to stand there in a polling station and watch people observe as their votes and the votes of their neighbors are counted in public view, knowing that there's no way you can cheat. Every vote is seen and scrutinized, and every total is transmitted by multiple text messages and phone calls to the party headquarters, as well as the vote counting center. It really makes you believe that democracy can function. And to see the day after the election, which was so hotly contested, and the Kuo-yu supporters were so sure they were going to win, and then to see people accept the result with either elation or disappointment and go back to the work of making society function. I mean, Americans could really learn a lot from watching how this all went down in Taiwan.
Oh, I quite agree. And hopefully the Americans who are watching this discussion right now will share the video with others later on and talk about that process. I vote by mail, so maybe the post office is in on this. Tom?
Well, I would like to congratulate the Taiwanese people for the progress that they've made, for the vibrant democracy that they've created, for the moral authority that I think they've shown the world under, really adverse conditions and circumstances. Taiwan has achieved tremendous soft power, and it's a wonderful and hospitable place. And I hope indeed that many Americans will go there on their vacation, because they're in for a real treat. If nothing else, get some good Taiwanese dumplings.
Yeah, I think there's uniformity on the panel on that one. Dan, what do you think?
Sorry, I thought you were going to call on Ray next. What I think is we need to keep in mind moving ahead when the PRC is likely to continue trying to pluck off Taiwan's diplomatic allies, the 15 remaining small states that recognize the Republic of China. That's probably going to continue, but I just looked it up. 46 countries plus the European Union recognize Taiwan as a de facto state. So basically, in a de jure sense, they recognize Taiwan not as a de jure state, but as a de facto state. They have effectively missions in Taiwan. And it's all the great powers, except for China and Russia, and we know what kind of powers they are. And most of the stronger middle ranking powers all recognize Taiwan as a de facto state. So it's not as isolated as you might think if you just look at the 15 small countries and so on. And again, tourist numbers are increasing. Tom just made the point, it's a great place to visit. People love Taiwan. So I think people there should take heart and not worry too much. I mean, I know it's important to have some states formally recognize you to still be considered as a state under international law, but it's not as dire a situation as it might otherwise seem. Taiwan's situation is actually quite good, I think, considering all the parameters.
The previous administration under Ma Ying-jeou made a big deal about visa-free travel to the United States and elsewhere. President Tsai made this point too, that you can take your Republic of China, Taiwan passport all over the world and emphasize that. Ray, you are our only Taiwanese citizen on the panel. We leave the last word to you. Tell us what you think.
Thank you, Clay. So yes, I am very happy about the result, especially when we went through such a heavy influence from China in terms of the nagging, in terms of the fake news, in terms of the United Front work, in terms of all sorts of sharp power tactics. So we survived. So I'm very happy about that. So I hope this kind of victory can continue. And also, I think the observation and also this kind of attention from the other society, especially from the United States, from other democratic countries, is vital for us. So I really glad we have this opportunity to share these opinions, and also people come to see us, to see our democracy. I'm really grateful for that. Thank you.
And thank you. Thanks to all our panelists. Thanks to all our viewers. On behalf of the USC U.S China Institute, we're really grateful for the time that you've shared with us today. Stay in touch, send us email, get on our mailing list, tell others. We look forward to our next encounter. Thanks to all of you. Bye.